I know where it
A pregnant
is,
woman is thrown to
but
the
I
marble
can't stay
floor
here.
by the man who vowed to protect her.
Meet me at the bridge
But
in
Richard
10
Sterling
minutes,
has no
alone.
idea who his wife really is or who her father is. One phone call in the middle of a storm brings 4 black SUVs to his mansion, and by morning, the powerful man who once ruled her life will learn what fear truly means.
He hit her so hard, she crashed to the marble floor before she could even scream. His ring cut her cheekbone. She tasted blood. And in that moment, hands pressed to her pregnant belly, 29-year-old Kate Sterling looked up at her husband and felt something inside her finally shatter. It wasn't her spirit or her will. It was something far more dangerous, her patience. Because what Richard Sterling didn't know, what nobody in Greenwich, Connecticut ever cared to find out, was who Kate's father really was. And tonight, that man was on his way. Now, before we go on, if this story is already grabbing you, please subscribe to our channel and see Kate's journey through to the very end. And go ahead and drop a comment telling me what city you're from. I love to see how far these stories travel. The rain had been pouring since 4 that afternoon, the kind of cold, driving Connecticut rain that seems to come in sideways, turning the long private driveway of the Sterling estate into a black river. The iron gate at the entrance was 14 feet tall. Security cameras along the stone wall blinked with little red lights every few seconds, swallowed by the downpour. From the outside, the mansion looked like exactly what it was: the home of a man who had spent 30 years making sure the world knew he was rich. Inside, Kate stood at the kitchen island, both hands wrapped around a mug of chamomile tea she hadn't touched in 20 minutes. She was listening, but not to the rain or the low hum of the furnace, or the TV she'd left on in the other room for company. She was listening for the sound of tires on the driveway. She was listening for the specific rumble of Richard's car, the heavy slam of the door, and the sharp click of his shoes on the steps. These were sounds that had come to mean one very specific thing to her over the past 3 years. They were sounds that told her to get ready. She put the mug down and laid a hand flat against her stomach. 7 months. She sometimes whispered the words like a prayer. 7 months. The baby shifted, a slow rolling feeling under her ribs. Kate breathed out through her nose, slow and steady, just like the therapist she'd secretly seen for only 2 sessions had taught her. She'd stopped seeing the therapist after that second appointment. Richard had found the receipt for the visit. Headlights swept across the kitchen window at 9:47. Kate heard the engine die. She heard the car door slam. She heard his shoes on the pavement. She picked up her mug, carried it to the sink, and stood with her back to the door. She'd learned over 3 years, it was better not to look like you were waiting. Looking like you were waiting annoyed him. Looking like you didn't care also annoyed him. There was no single posture, no expression, no tone of voice that was ever reliably safe. But she had learned what things were more dangerous than others. She worked within those rules, the way a person learns to live in a house with a loose floorboard. Carefully, always, and never forgetting it's there. The front door opened. She heard him yank it open. He always pulled it too hard, and the sound echoed in the marble entryway. She heard his keys hit the table. She heard him sigh. Then she turned around. Richard Sterling was 54 years old and had been a handsome man for most of his life. He was tall and broad, with perfectly cut silver hair and blue eyes that in the right light could almost look kind. He was wearing his charcoal gray suit, the one for meetings in the city, and it was soaked through at the shoulders. His face was tense in a way she knew all too well, a controlled rage simmering just under his skin, like pressure building beneath ice. He stared at her, but didn't say a word. "There's soup on the stove," Kate said. Her voice was perfectly level. She had gotten very good at keeping her voice level. "And I made that bread you like. It's still warm." Richard walked right past her, ignoring the soup, the bread, and her. He went to the liquor cabinet, poured 2 inches of whiskey into a glass, and drank half of it in one go. Kate just waited. "Hennessy pulled out," he said. She knew better than to ask what he meant. She knew Hennessy was a huge development deal, something he had been working on for the better part of a year. She'd heard the name on phone calls she wasn't supposed to hear, in conversations that died, the second she entered a room. "I'm so sorry," she said. "Are you?" It wasn't a real question. He picked up his glass and finished the rest of the whiskey. "You're sorry. That's a big help, Kate. Thanks. Is there anything I can do?" He laughed, but it was a cold sound. "What could you possibly do? What do you bring to the table that could ever be useful?" He slammed the glass down on the counter. "I've been carrying this house, this marriage, every single thing for 3 years. And the one time I need things to work out, I come home to you standing here looking at me like a scared rabbit." Kate kept her hands hanging at her sides. "I'm not frightened." "You should be," he said, and started walking toward her. There it was. It was that thing she had learned to watch for, the switch from controlled anger to something else. It happened so fast when it happened, faster than anyone who hasn't lived it could ever believe. 1 minute he was pouring a drink. The next, the space between them was 3 feet, then 2, and his entire presence felt different. It felt charged, dangerous, like the air right before a lightning strike. "Richard." Her voice was low, not from fear, but from pure instinct. "Richard, stop." "Stop what?" "I'm standing in my own kitchen, in my own house." He was close enough now for her to smell the whiskey on his breath, and something else under it, the sour smell of a man who's been stewing in his own rage for hours. "You want to tell me to stop? Who are you, Kate? What are you without me? Please don't do this tonight." "Don't do what?" "Talk? Have a simple conversation with my wife." His hand shot out and grabbed her upper arm. It wasn't hard enough to leave a mark. He was good at that, but it was hard enough to hold her right where she was. "I need you to understand what this has cost me. The lawyers, the setbacks, the way you've been. God, you've been nothing but a burden since the day we got married. You're hurting me." His voice was quiet, precise. His grip got tighter. "I am talking to you. The baby," she said, saying it on purpose. She had learned that sometimes that word could work. "Richard, you're going to hurt the baby." Something flickered across his face, something complicated. For just a second, she thought it was going to work. She thought she saw the pressure ease, the ice begin to crack. And then his phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced down at it, and whatever he saw on that screen snapped the last bit of his control and destroyed it completely. He shoved her with both hands on her shoulders. She stumbled back, catching the edge of the counter with her arm. And that's when he hit her, an open palm across the right side of her face. It was hard enough to snap her head to the side. Hard enough that her vision went white for a split second. And then she was falling, her knees hitting the marble first. Her hands shot out in front of her to try and break her fall. She heard herself make a strange sound she didn't recognize. She heard him say something. She heard her own heart pounding in her ears. She was on her knees on the kitchen floor, one hand pressed to her face, the other flat against her belly, and she was shaking. But not from weakness, she realized, and not exactly from fear. It was just something physical, something her body was doing on its own after the impact. She could taste the metallic tang of blood, where her teeth had cut the inside of her cheek. "Get up," Richard said. His voice was cold now. When it got cold, it was somehow even worse than when it was angry. "Get up off the floor. You look pathetic." Kate looked up at him. She had looked up at him from the floor before. Twice before tonight, if she was keeping score, which she was, she always was. And both of those times, something inside her had scrambled to find a way to make herself smaller, quieter, easier. A way to disappear into a version of herself that wouldn't make him continue. But this time was different. She had no idea what her face looked like in that moment, but Richard actually took a small step back. She got to her feet slowly, using the counter for support. She stood, distributing her weight evenly, her hand still pressed to her cheek, and looked at her husband without a single blink. "I'm going upstairs," she said. "We're not finished here. I'm going upstairs," she repeated. Same tone, same volume. And something about the repetition, about how steady her voice was, made him stay quiet. She walked right past him, out of the kitchen, through the hall, and up the curved staircase to the second floor. She could feel his eyes on her back the whole time. She never looked back. She walked into their bedroom, shut the door, and stood in the dark for 30 seconds, leaning her forehead against the cool wood, slowly and deliberately getting her breathing back under control. Then she crossed the room, sat on the edge of the bed, and opened the nightstand drawer. She reached past the chapstick, past the book she'd been trying to read for 6 months, past a half-empty pack of antacids. And she found what she was looking for. A phone. Not her phone. This wasn't the phone Richard paid for, the one he had complete access to. Not the one he checked after he thought she was asleep. This was a different phone. A cheap prepaid burner she'd bought with cash at a gas station 3 months ago. She carried it in her bag, then moved it to the nightstand drawer every night just before he came home. She'd bought it for an emergency. When she turned it on, the screen lit up the darkness. After 3 months in a drawer, it still had a 40% charge. She stared at it. Her cheek was already starting to swell up. She could feel that distinct heat and pressure of a bruise forming under her skin. Her hands were still shaking a little, so she pressed them together to try and stop it. The phone had only one contact saved. Just one. There was no name, only a number with an international prefix, a sequence she memorized when other kids were learning their multiplication tables. She had promised herself she would never, ever use it. And she had meant it too. She knew, even as she bought the phone, even as her hands shook programming the number in that gas station parking lot, that using it would change everything. It would tear down walls that could never be rebuilt. It would start something that she couldn't stop. She sat there on the bed, hand on her swelling cheek, her unborn child stirring inside her, and she thought about those walls. She thought about what was on the other side. She thought about who she was before she became Mrs. Richard Sterling, and what that person would tell her to do right now. She pressed call. It rang twice. A voice on the other end said, "Katya." It was low, accented, and perfectly calm, the way truly dangerous men are calm, because they've never had a reason not to be. It was a voice that hadn't changed in the 10 years since she last heard it. "Papa," she said in English, but then she switched without thinking. The language of her childhood just came back, the way it always did when she was scared. It didn't ask permission, it just arrived. She spoke 4 clear sentences in Russian, explaining what happened and what she needed. There was a silence on the other end that lasted for exactly 3 seconds. "Where is he now?" her father asked. "Downstairs." "Is the gate code still the same one you sent?" She had sent it 3 months ago, the same day she bought the phone. Just in case, she'd told herself. just in case. "Yes," she said. "Go to the east wing." Her father said, "The room at the end of the hall." "Stay there. Do not open the door for anyone who does not say the name." "What name?" "Sunrise," he said. "You remember." And she did remember. She was 7 years old when she learned it. The protocol word. The word that meant your family was coming and you were safe. "How long?" she asked. "We are already in Connecticut," her father said. Then the line went dead. Kate just sat there with the phone in her lap, closed her eyes and breathed. In through her nose, out through her mouth. The baby shifted again, a slow somersault she felt all the way up in her ribs. She pressed her palm against the movement and said quietly in Russian what her mother used to say to her, "We are all right. We are going to be all right now." She stood up, walked to the window, and looked out into the rain. For a second, all she saw was her own reflection, the swollen cheek, the dark eyes, the nightgown that had become her uniform. Then she looked past herself to the gate at the end of the long driveway. She could just barely see the red blinking light of the security system. She watched it for a moment. Then she turned from the window, walked out of the bedroom and down the hall toward the east wing. Downstairs, Richard had poured a third whiskey and was sitting in his study, phone pressed to his ear, making a list of people to blame for the Hennessy deal. His lawyer was number 1 on the list. His project manager was number 2. He hadn't gotten to himself on that list yet, and he probably never would. He was the kind of man whose entire sense of self was built on the foundation of his own success, so any failure had to be somebody else's fault. "I need you to call Franklin," he was saying. "First thing in the morning, tell him I want a meeting. Not a phone call, a meeting, in person. Tell him." He stopped. He'd heard something. It wasn't inside the house. It was outside. A sound that didn't belong. He went to the study window and looked out. But the rain was too heavy, and the night was too dark. He couldn't see anything past his own reflection. Then the security light at the gate went dark. It just was switched off completely. Richard frowned, pressing his face closer to the glass. Something was moving up the driveway, something long and dark and slow. Then he saw there was more than one. He counted 1, 2, 3. By the time he got to 4, he'd pulled the phone from his ear, staring with the look of a man whose brain can't process what he's seeing. 4 black SUVs were moving up his driveway. Their lights were off, their wipers were on, and their engines were almost completely silenced by the rain. "Richard?" His lawyer's voice sounded tiny from the phone. "Richard, are you there?" Richard Sterling had survived 30 years in cutthroat real estate by trusting his gut when it spoke. And right now, it was screaming. It was telling him something was wrong, on a level he couldn't even imagine. "I'll call you back," he said, and he hung up. He went to his desk drawer and pulled out the pistol he kept there, a Sig Sauer 9mm he'd bought after a business rival made threats 6 years ago. The threats never came to anything, but they'd scared him enough to get a license. He hadn't fired it in 4 years. He picked it up and checked the magazine, trying to remember how the instructor had shown him. He was still standing behind his desk when the front door of his mansion just opened. He hadn't heard a knock. He hadn't heard the alarm. Both of those things should have been impossible. He moved from his study into the hallway with the gun at his side. He was afraid, but in that moment, he was more embarrassed about being afraid than actually scared. The entryway lights were on. He could see the marble floor, the table with his keys still on it, and the big mirror hanging over it. And in that mirror, he saw the reflection of 2 men stepping through his front door. They were in black rain gear, moving with a quiet, practiced skill that told him immediately these were not men who had come to talk. And there were more of them coming in behind. What? He raised the gun. This is private property. I have a weapon. I will. The man on the left glanced at the gun with a look of polite boredom. He reached out and simply took it from Richard's hand, so smoothly that Richard had let it go before he even decided to. He just stood there, empty-handed, staring at this man now holding his gun pointed at the floor, like he'd held 1,000 of them before. "Mr. Sterling," the man said. His English was perfect, but with an accent Richard couldn't quite place. Eastern European, maybe Russian. Please do not do that again. It creates complications nobody wants. Who are you? Richard's voice was almost steady. Who sent you? If this is about Hennessy, Mr. Sterling. The man placed the gun on the console table, right next to Richard's keys. That calm, deliberate action was somehow more terrifying than any threat he could have made. "My name is not important," the man said. "The man whose name is important is outside. He would like to speak with you." "I'm not speaking to anyone until someone tells me what the hell is going on in my house." The man's expression didn't change at all. "Your house?" he said. "Yes, we can discuss that." He stepped aside, gesturing toward the open front door, toward the rain and the darkness. Richard Sterling looked at the open door, at the men standing on either side of it, and then at the staircase that led up to his wife. He was beginning to understand that she had somehow started something tonight that was far beyond anything he could have ever imagined. He walked to the door. Standing on the mansion's front steps, with rain pouring down around him and 4 black SUVs parked on his driveway, was a man Richard Sterling had never seen. He looked to be about 60 years old, maybe older. He was the kind of man where age settles like stone, not weight. He wore a dark overcoat but had no umbrella, and the rain didn't seem to bother him at all. Or maybe he'd just decided a long time ago not to be bothered by things he couldn't control. He stood with his hands behind his back, perfectly still, just looking up at the house. When Richard appeared in the doorway, the man's eyes shifted to him. They were pale eyes, blue or gray. It was hard to tell in the rain. And they looked Richard over with the slow, careful attention of someone taking inventory. "Mr. Sterling," the man said. His English was even better than the men inside, formal, almost elegant. "My name is Mikhail Vulov. I believe we have a great deal to discuss." He paused. "About my daughter." Richard Sterling felt the ground beneath him crumble, and it had nothing to do with the storm. He said, "I don't think Kate's father is," and he stopped. He was about to say the word dead, but the man standing before him was very much alive. In that moment, he realized everything Kate had ever told him about her family was a lie. "Yes," said Mickey Vulov with the slightest hint of a smile. "I think we should go inside." He walked through the front door of the Sterling mansion as if he owned it. And as Richard would soon learn, that wasn't far from the truth. He didn't rush. He didn't gawk at the room like a man impressed by money. He glanced at the marble floors, the crystal chandelier, the expensive paintings on the walls. It was the way a man inspects a hotel room, noting what's useful and ignoring the rest. 2 of his men moved in front, 2 more behind him. No one spoke. They didn't have to. Richard Sterling took 3 steps back, then forced himself to stop. Deep down, in some stubborn part of his soul, he was still Richard Sterling. And Richard Sterling didn't back down from anyone in his own home. He demanded, "I want to know who gave you the authority to set foot on my property." His voice had regained some of its power. Not all of it, but enough. "Whatever this is, whatever you think you're doing, you need to understand I have lawyers who will." "Sit down, Mr. Sterling." It wasn't a request. It was polite. It sounded like a request, but underneath was something hard as steel. And Richard heard it loud and clear, so he sat. He dropped into the chair by the fireplace, the ones his wife sometimes used on Sunday mornings. He sat with the stiff posture of a man pretending he chose to sit down, rather than being ordered to. Miki Vulov did not sit. "My daughter," he said, "called me approximately 47 minutes ago." "Do you know what she told me?" Richard said nothing. Vulov continued, with the calm patience of a man who had done this many times before. "She told me that her husband struck her while she was carrying his child." He let that sentence hang in the air for a moment. Then he added, "She told me this in Russian." "Did you know she spoke Russian, Mr. Sterling?" After a pause, he whispered, "No." Vulov clasped his hands behind his back. "There are many things you don't know about my daughter. We'll get to them. But first, answer one simple question for me. I like to know who I'm dealing with. Did you strike her?" Richard's jaw went tight. "That's between my wife and me." The man to Vulov's left, the one who took his gun, took half a step forward. Just half a step, but Richard felt it like a sudden drop in temperature. "Did you strike her?" Vulov asked again, his voice unchanged. There was a disagreement. Things escalated. "I didn't mean to." "Yes or no, Mr. Sterling?" The silence in the room was deafening. Richard Sterling looked into Miki Vulov's eyes and saw a kind of patience that never had to get angry, because it always got what it wanted in the end. He was the first to look away. "Yes," he said. Vulov gave one slow nod, like a man who already knew the answer, but needed the formality of hearing it said out loud. "Thank you," he said, "for your honesty. It will make things easier." He then turned and walked toward the grand staircase. Richard started to get up, but two of the men shifted, and he sat right back down. He didn't need to be touched. He understood. "Where is she?" Vulov asked, not looking at Richard, but at the man to his right. The man pulled out a phone, spoke into it in Russian, listened, then said in English, "East wing, end of the hall." Vulov went up the stairs. Richard sat in his chair, listening to the footsteps, and counted the men left in the room. 3, and more outside. He did the math, and he did not like the answer. Upstairs, in a dark room at the end of the east wing, Kate heard the knock. She was sitting on the floor, her back against the wall, her knees pulled up to her pregnant belly, clutching a prepaid phone. She hadn't turned on the lights. It felt safer in the dark, where she couldn't see her own reflection in the mirror. She didn't want to see her face. Then the knock came. 2 short taps, then one long one. A signal she hadn't heard since she was a little girl. She stood up and opened the door. Her father looked at her face for exactly 2 seconds. For a flash, something flickered behind his cold, controlled eyes. Then he stepped forward and placed both hands on her cheeks, as gently as if he were holding something priceless. He turned her face to the light. The bruise was fully visible now. The right side of her face, from her cheek to her jaw, was a deep red, already darkening to purple. Miki Vulov stared at it for a long time. He lowered his hands and said very quietly in Russian, "I should have come sooner, Papa." Her voice cracked on the word, and she hated it. She hated sounding so weak. But she was 7 months pregnant. Her face was throbbing, and her father was here, for the first time in 10 years. Her body just couldn't keep up the act of being okay. "How did you even?" She stopped, switched to English, then back again. "I didn't think you'd come yourself. Where else would I be?" he asked. He stepped into the room, looked at her with his full attention, and said, "Let me look at you." He wasn't looking at the bruise anymore. He was looking at her. The way he used to when she was little. as if he was measuring her strength. "Are you hurt anywhere else?" The baby's fine." I checked. "I've been monitoring." "Good." He pulled a chair from the corner and put it right in front of her, then sat down. That simple gesture, him sitting, putting himself below her eye level, it broke something open inside her chest. "Sit," he said. She sat on the edge of the bed, and they just looked at each other. 10 years, she whispered. 10 years, he agreed. "You didn't come to the wedding. You didn't invite me. Because you knew," she stopped, biting her lip. "I knew what you would have done if you'd met him. I knew what you would have found out. I wanted." She looked down at her hands. "I wanted to believe I'd made the right choice. I needed to believe it without you there to prove me wrong." Vulov was quiet for a moment, and now she looked up at him. "He hit me, Papa. While I'm pregnant. While I was carrying his son." Her voice was strong again. She had found her resolve in the last 30 seconds. That was the third time. The third time. She watched her father's face as he took in that number, watched the absolute stillness. It wasn't a lack of emotion, but a powerful, tight control of it. "You should have called me after the first time," he said. "I know. Why didn't you?" And that was the real question, wasn't it? The one she'd been asking herself for the last 2.5 years. She looked at her father, this man who raised her in a world of power, violence, and unbreakable loyalty. The man who sent her away at 19 because he wanted a better life for her. He had watched her go and respected her wishes not to follow, and she tried to find the real answer. "Because calling you meant admitting I failed," she said. "And calling you meant becoming your daughter again. Not Kate Sterling. Not just Kate, but Katya Volova, your heir." She paused. "I wasn't ready for that. And now?" She looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "He hit me for the third time while I'm 7 months pregnant. I'm ready." Downstairs, Richard Sterling had been sitting in that chair for 9 minutes. He was counting. He was also studying the men in the room, searching for any weakness, any opening he could exploit. There were no openings. These men weren't security guards or nightclub bouncers. They were something else entirely. He knew it the way a rabbit knows the difference between a dog and a wolf. He tried a new tactic. "I want to speak to whoever is in charge," he announced to the room. No one moved. The man who came in. Vulov. "I want to talk to him now." He tried to put his commanding boardroom tone back into his voice. "I understand he's upset. As a father myself, I can respect that. But there are 2 sides to every story, and I think if we all sit down, the 3 of us, Kate included, we can." "Mr. Sterling." The man who had taken his gun was looking at him. "We appreciate your patience. I'm not being patient." "I am being. You are being patient," the man said, with a tone that slammed the conversation shut like a steel door. Richard closed his mouth. For 30 years, he had been the most powerful person in nearly every room he entered. He had always known it. But not in this room. Not anymore. The feeling that this night was completely out of his control had been growing since the SUVs pulled into his driveway. Each new realization was heavier than the last. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He reached for it slowly, watching the men in the room, but no one tried to stop him. He glanced at the screen. It was his lawyer. He answered. "Richard, what is going on? You were supposed to call back." "I need you to look up a name for me," Richard said, keeping his voice steady and low. "Right now." "The name is Mail Vulov. He's Eastern European, maybe Russian, tied to real estate or something called Vulov." There was a pause on the line, then a much longer one. "Richard, where are you?" "I'm at home." "Why?" What is it? I'm looking. His lawyer's voice cracked, all the confidence suddenly gone. Richard, the Vulov name. There is a Mikhail Vulov connected to the Vulov syndicate. The government has files on them. Another pause, and Richard could hear frantic typing. Richard, you do not negotiate with these people. You don't. Why is this name connected to you? He's in my house, Richard said. The silence on the other end of the phone lasted 4 very long seconds. Get out of there, his lawyer whispered. Now, do whatever you have to. Just get out. Richard looked at the 3 men surrounding him, and the 2 more guarding the front door. He thought about the staircase where Vulov had vanished 20 minutes ago. I don't think that's really an option, he said, and hung up. 23 minutes had passed since Vulov went upstairs. When he returned, he walked with the calm certainty of a man who already knew how everything would end. Kate was not with him. Richard noticed that right away. Where is my wife? She is resting, Vulov said, taking the chair opposite Richard. It wasn't Richard's usual chair, but a smaller one he positioned to face him directly. He sat with perfect calm. She needs her rest. We are not going to disturb her. She is my wife, Richard said, hating the desperate sound of his own voice. Whatever she told you, whatever you think happened. I know what happened tonight, Vulov said plainly. My daughter told me. You told me. And the bruise on her face confirms it. He leaned back slightly. Mr. Sterling, I want to tell you about my family, who we are. I think it will clarify your situation. He paused. My daughter grew up in a world most people don't even know exists. She was educated in 4 different countries. She speaks 5 languages, including the one she stopped using when she married you. From a young age, she was trained to manage massive assets, handle complex legal systems, and make decisions most wealthy men like you will never face. He watched Richard's face for a reaction. She left that life because I gave her a choice. I loved her enough to let her choose a different path, and she chose you. Richard didn't say a word. She chose a man, Vulov went on, who had no idea who she was. Who just saw a beautiful, quiet, smart woman and thought she was something he could control, something he could break down. He tilted his head. How long did it take for you to hit her? Silence. 8 months, Richard said. He wasn't sure why he admitted it. The words just spilled out from the pressure. Vulov just looked at him. 8 months into the marriage. Richard started to make an excuse, then stopped. There was nothing he could say that would make it better. 8 months, Vulov repeated slowly. She stayed for 3 years. I want you to consider what that says about my daughter's capacity for hope. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and the entire room felt like it shrank. And I want you to consider what it means that she finally called me. My daughter would only make that call when she was absolutely, completely done. Richard's mouth felt like cotton. What do you want, money? I want you to listen, Vulov said. He wasn't angry, not at all, which was somehow much worse. You will listen to me, and you will understand exactly what happens next. Then you will sign the documents my people have prepared, and we will be finished here. Documents? Richard sat up straighter. What documents? I haven't agreed to, Mr. Sterling. Vulov raised one hand, and that was enough. You struck my pregnant daughter 3 times during your marriage. Tonight, you hit her badly enough to make her bleed. I have a doctor on the way to document that injury. I also have financial investigators who have spent the last 90 days examining every single account and company you own. He paused. I have been preparing for this moment since the day you married her. Richard felt a chill run through him. You've been watching me? I have been protecting my daughter, Vulov corrected him. There's a difference. She didn't know. It was her choice to live without my protection, and I respected that. But I prepared because I know men like you, Mr. Sterling. And I knew this call would come. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document, placing it on the table between them. Divorce. Full transfer of assets. The Greenwich house, the New York properties, the 3 accounts in the Cayman Islands. Yes, I know about those. Everything goes to my daughter. Complete and uncontested. Richard stared at the paper. Then he looked up. And if I don't sign... The room became so quiet you could feel it, the silence of people holding their breath. Vulov looked at him for a long, heavy moment. Then we will discuss the alternative, he said. And I promise you, Mr. Sterling, you do not want to discuss the alternative. Richard's hands were shaking, so he pressed them flat against his legs to hide it. His mind raced through every possible option, every contact he had, every favor he could call in. But every idea turned to dust before he could grasp it. He was starting to understand, really understand, that the man across from him had already considered every move he could possibly make, like a grandmaster playing against a beginner. You can't do this legally, Richard said. Whatever this is, these documents won't stand up in court. I'll fight them. You'll find, Vulov said quietly, that they are perfectly legal, ironclad. They were prepared over the last 6 weeks by 3 of the best lawyers in New York City. He paused. And you'll find that the evidence of your assault tonight, along with the financial crimes my team found in your business, will make fighting this settlement far more painful for you than just signing. Richard's voice was barely a whisper. Who are you? I told you who I am. No, Richard looked at him. I mean, who are you, really? Kate told me her father was a property developer from Eastern Europe. She said he died when she was 12. She said, Vulov interrupted, what I told her to say. There was a trace of something like guilt in his voice. I made her say those things to protect her, so that no one who got close to her could get close to me. He looked at Richard with an expression that was almost pity. It wasn't fair to her. I see that now. And upstairs, in a room at the end of the hall, Kate Sterling sat with her hands folded over her stomach. Her back was straight, her face calm, the way a person's face looks after they have no more tears to cry. It wasn't peace, but it was resolve. She listened to the rain tapping on the windows and thought about the 19-year-old girl she had been, putting her father on a plane and promising him she would live a normal life. She thought about what that normal life had actually become. The first year, she actually believed in it. The second year, she started to see the problems. By the third year, those problems were giant holes in her life. But she was so stubborn, so set on not being Katya Volkova, that she accepted things no woman should. She stayed in a house that felt more like a cage, telling herself every morning that this was her choice, that she was in control, that she was not her father's daughter. She pressed her hands against her belly, and the baby moved, a slow, steady presence. She was her father's daughter. She always had been. And tonight, sitting in the dark in a mansion that no longer belonged to Richard Sterling, she stopped fighting it. That fact settled over her, not like a cage, but like a suit of armor. She heard footsteps outside, then a soft knock. One of her father's men opened the door. Emsm. Volova, he said. It was the first time she had heard that name said to her in 10 years. It felt different now. Not like a leash, but like a key. Your father would like to know if you are ready to come downstairs. Kate looked at the door, then down at her hands. She pictured Richard's face in the kitchen, that cold look in his eyes as he stared down at her on the floor. The certainty that she was nothing to him, less than nothing. She thought about the basic respect he gave everyone else in his life, but never her. And then she stood up. Yes, she said she would. She walked to the top of the staircase and looked down into the hall of a house she'd lived in for 3 years and never felt safe in. She saw her father's sitting across from her husband, a document on the table between them. She saw Richard's face as he heard her footsteps, looked up, and saw her standing there. And for the first time since their wedding day, Kate watched Richard Sterling look at her and be afraid. She came down the stairs slowly. Her posture was different than it was 2 hours ago. Something in her spine had straightened. It wasn't defiance or a performance, but her reclaiming a part of herself that had been waiting for her to return. She crossed the room, stopping beside her father's chair. Richard looked up at her. Kate. His voice was almost unrecognizable, stripped of all its usual authority. What was left was small and naked. Kate, listen to me. Whatever he told you, whatever he promised you, this is not who you are. You are not these people. You are my wife, and we have a child coming. And if you just, Richard. Her voice was quiet, but absolute. Sign the paper. He stared. Sign the paper, she said again. And this ends tonight. Everyone goes home. You keep your health, and whatever your lawyers can save for you. She held his gaze. Don't sign it. And my father will explain to you what the alternative looks like. And I promise you, Richard, you do not want to have that conversation. She watched him search her face for the woman he married, for the compliance, the fear, the managed smallness he relied on, and realized that she just wasn't there. That perhaps she'd never truly been there, had only been borrowed, and the loan was now due. He reached for the pen. It scratched across the document at 11:22 p.m., and Richard Sterling's hand was shaking so much that his signature was a mess, completely unlike his own. He knew it. He stared at that trembling, weak version of his name, and something inside him completely caved in. Like a building that doesn't fall at once, but collapses floor by floor, each level giving way. He dropped the pen on the table. No one spoke. Volkov's man, the one with the bored expression, picked up the document. He examined the signature and gave a single nod to Volkov. Volkov glanced at it briefly, then folded it and put it in his coat without any ceremony. Like filing away an everyday task, just another box checked. Richard looked at Kate. She was still by her father's chair, hands over her belly, her face giving him nothing. He searched for anger, for satisfaction, grief, anything he could use, anything he recognized. He found only a calm that scared him more than any other expression could have. You planned this, he said, his voice hollow. You have been planning this. I made a phone call, Kate said. Tonight, after you put me on the floor. Don't. His jaw tightened. Don't make it sound simple. Don't make it sound like. He stood up so fast the 2 men in the room tensed, then stopped when Volkov raised a hand. Richard stood there, full of fury with nowhere for it to go. You lied to me. For 3 years, you sat in this house and lied to me about everything. Your family, your name, all of it. Kate looked at him calmly. I did not lie to you about who I was. I showed you exactly who I was. You just decided to see me as smaller than that. Your father is, he gestured at Volkov with a mix of rage and confusion. Do you know what your father is? What he does? You think I'm the villain here? You grew up with Richard. Her voice cut cleanly through his. Not loud, just precise, like a scalpel. You struck a pregnant woman tonight in your own kitchen. Everything else is just noise. The silence that followed was absolute. Richard sat back down. He had nowhere else to go. Volkov rose from his chair, unhurried, and buttoned his coat. He looked at Richard with an expression somewhere between pity and contempt, like a man who has seen this exact scene many times before. "My people will be in contact with your attorneys in the morning. I advise you to tell them to cooperate. Any delay, any challenge to the settlement, any communication with my daughter that she has not started herself will be seen as a decision to explore other options." He paused. "I trust I do not need to explain what that means." Richard said nothing. "Good." Volkov turned to Kate. He spoke to her in quiet Russian, and she answered back, and their exchange in those few seconds was theirs alone. He then kissed her forehead, on the unbruised side, a formal but tender gesture, and he walked to the door. He stopped on the threshold without turning. He said in English, "For Richard's sake, in my experience, Mr. Sterling, a man who hits a woman does so because he is afraid of what she would become if he did not." He opened the door. "Tonight, you found out." He walked out into the rain. Kate stood in the entrance hall of her own home, listening to the SUVs pull away one by one until the last engine faded into the storm. 2 of her father's men stayed. She had not asked them to. She suspected her father had not asked either. They were just staying. It was protocol, and Volkov protocol did not require any discussion. Richard had not moved from the chair. She looked at him, really looked at him in a way she had not let herself do for a long time. Because looking at something so painful requires a courage that is hard to manage every day. He looked old. Not in years, he was 54, but he had always looked strong, wearing his age like an expensive accessory. But in that moment, he looked exhausted in a way that went deep into his bones. She almost felt something for him. She examined that almost feeling, honestly, the way she had learned to in the 2 therapy sessions she had been allowed. She decided what she felt was not compassion. It was more like recognizing a cornered animal that was no longer a danger. The fear doesn't go away instantly just because the threat is gone. But you can see it differently. "You should sleep," she said. "I am going to need you clear-headed in the morning. There are calls to make." He looked up. "Are you serious? There's a guest room on the 3rd floor," she continued. "I think it would be better if we did not share the master bedroom tonight." Kate. His voice cracked on her name. It actually broke, like a support beam giving way. "Kate, I know. I know I have been. I know that tonight was, Richard." She stopped him, not unkindly but firmly. "Don't. I have heard that sentence so many times. I know every version of it. The version where you're sorry. The version where it will never happen again. The one where you say stress is making you someone you are not." She shook her head. "I am 7 months pregnant, standing here with a bruise on my face and my father's men next door. We are past the version where you get to explain." He stared at her. "Go upstairs," she said. "3rd floor, get some sleep. Tomorrow we will handle this." He stood. He walked to the staircase, put his hand on the banister, and paused with his back to her. And she could see the effort it took him to climb those stairs. It was not physical effort, but something else. The effort of a man walking into a future he had not designed and did not want. "Did you ever love me?" he asked, still not looking at her. She thought about it, giving him an honest answer. "Yes," she said. "In the beginning, I did." He nodded once, like a man receiving a painful but necessary truth. Then he climbed the stairs, and she listened as his footsteps faded, until a door closed somewhere on the 3rd floor. She stood alone in the hall. The two remaining men were in the kitchen. She could hear one of them making coffee, which, on any other night, would have felt surreal. She pressed both hands to her belly, closed her eyes, and took one deep breath. Then she went to the sitting room, turned on a lamp, and sat down to wait for morning. She did not sleep. She had not expected to. She sat with her feet tucked beneath her because her back had been aching for a week. And she let her mind sift through the night's events, like walking through a flooded house, room by room, assessing the damage. What had broken, what survived, what would need to be rebuilt, and what should be left behind. At 2 a.m, one of her father's men knocked softly and told her that her father was on the phone. She took the call in the sitting room, keeping her voice low out of habit. Then she caught herself. That habit belonged to the old house, the house where Richard was always listening. She did not live in that house anymore. The thought felt like something being unlocked. "The physician will be there at 8, her father said. "This is for the legal record. It has to be done before the bruises fade." "I know," she said. "How are you feeling?" The question was so simple, so direct. 3 words nobody in this house had asked her in, well, she couldn't remember how long. She looked at the ceiling, blinked, and said, "I'm all right. I'm doing better than I thought I would be." "That is the strength in you," her father said. She almost smiled. "Don't push it." A pause. "Katya." He used her real name. "We need to discuss what comes next, your position, your assets, the child's future. Not tonight, but soon." "I know," she said again. "You do not have to handle everything at once." "I understand that," she shifted, fixing the pillow behind her. "But I need to understand what I am inheriting. All of it. Whatever you have been managing, I want to properly understand it this time." There was another, longer pause. When her father finally spoke, his voice had a tone she had not heard since she was a little girl. It was a feeling that, in any other man, might have been called pride. "Then we will sit down. When the baby is here and you are ready, we will go through it all." "Everything," she confirmed. "Everything," he said. She hung up and sat in the lamplight, thinking about that word, everything, what it held and what it would demand of her. The life she had tried to create, away from her father's influence, had turned out to be a fantasy. Not because that life was impossible, but because she had tried to build it with the wrong man, on a foundation that was broken from the very start. The question was not if she could go back to the person she once was. She couldn't go back. She was someone else now. She was a mother. 7 weeks from her due date, she was a woman who had survived something, and she wore the proof of it on her face. The question was what she would build next, on what ground, and who she would build it for. She pressed her hand flat against her lower belly and felt the baby move. She thought, "We will figure this out." She said it the way her mother used to, not as a comfort, but as a command, a task to be completed. At 6:45 in the morning, she heard Richard come downstairs. She'd expected him much earlier. She thought he would try something in the dead of night, make a call, move money, do what cornered men like Richard always do, act before they even realize how small the trap is. She had been a little surprised that he hadn't. Hearing his footsteps on the stairs, she wondered if the fight had taken something out of him for good. He came to the living room doorway and stopped. He had changed out of his ruined suit. He was wearing the cashmere sweater she gave him for Christmas, a detail that struck her as odd. That out of everything he owned, he chose the one thing she gave him. And there, in the pale morning light, he looked truly smaller. Not pretending to be small. Not faking exhaustion to get sympathy. Actually smaller. He was diminished in the way proud men are when they can no longer escape who they really are. He looked at her face, at the bruise, which she knew was even darker now in the daylight. She watched his eyes see it and saw something shift inside him that didn't feel completely staged. "I need coffee," he finally said. "There's a pot in the kitchen," she replied. He left. She could hear him moving around in there, the specific sounds of a man lost in his own kitchen, completely unsure of himself. 2 of her father's men were still in the house. She heard Richard speak to them, a short, clipped exchange, then silence, then a mug being placed on the counter. He returned with a coffee he hadn't offered to make for her. Then he stopped, looked at the empty cup on the table beside her, and asked, Do you want anything?" It was such a tiny, pathetic gesture. She considered it for a single second and said, "I'm fine." He sat across from her, but not in his usual chair. She noticed he avoided the one by the fireplace he always took, and instead chose a smaller chair near the door, as if his authority in the room was already gone. He held the coffee mug with both hands and stared at the floor. "Your lawyers will be calling mine at 9, Kate said. "You need to tell your team to cooperate. Any asset my father's people have marked has been marked for a reason. Fighting it will cost you more than just giving it up." He looked up. Is there anything left? After everything, she had thought about this. She'd thought about it for hours in the quiet lamplight. "The Aspen house isn't part of the settlement. It was bought before we were married. It's yours." She paused. "And whatever you build after this, that's yours, too. I'm not trying to destroy you, Richard. I'm leaving you." He was quiet for a second. "There's a difference." "Yes," she said. "There is." He looked at the bruise again. She let him look. She had decided around 4 in the morning that she wouldn't cover it up. Not today, not in this house. She had spent 3 years making herself smaller, quieter, and easier. She was done hiding the proof of it. "I want you to know," he said, then stopped. "I don't need you to. I want you to know," he repeated, firmer this time, which surprised her, "that I understand what I did. I'm not going to make excuses. I'm not going to talk about stress or the deal or any of it. I understand what I did." He looked down at his hands. "I don't know when I became a person who could do that. I don't know when it started, but I know it was wrong all 3 times. I know." She listened to him, weighing his words. She had been waiting 3 years to hear something like this. And now that it was here, sitting in front of her in the morning light, she realized it wasn't nothing. It wasn't nothing. It did matter that he said it. She was honest enough to admit that to herself. But it was also completely and irreversibly too late. "I believe you," she said. "I believe you mean that right now, and I hope you remember this for the next person in your life. I hope you hold on to that feeling and let it change you." She stood up carefully. "But it doesn't change this." She walked to the doorway and stopped, turning back around. "I want you out of this house by noon," she said. "Take what you need for a week. The lawyers will arrange for you to get the rest." He looked at her, this woman he had married, and underestimated, and hit, and thought he knew. And he nodded slowly, with a look that finally seemed like a true understanding. She went upstairs. The doctor arrived at 8 o'clock sharp. It was a woman, which Kate hadn't expected, but was grateful for. She was a calm, professional woman in her 50s who introduced herself as Dr. Harmon and did the examination with a warm efficiency. She took photos of the injury. She checked the baby's heartbeat. Strong and steady, 150 beats per minute. A sound that let Kate breathe out a relief that went all the way through her. She wrote everything down in a way that would be valid in court. She asked Kate if she was safe now, and Kate said yes. Dr. Harmon glanced at the two men standing in the hallway and understood the whole situation without another word. "The bruising will look its worst in about 48 hours, Dr. Harmon told her. "I want you to rest today. I mean real rest. Not the kind where you are still managing things while lying down." She gave Kate a look that was both professional and deeply understanding. "Is there someone who can stay with you?" "My father is sending someone," Kate said. "Good." Dr. Harmon packed her bag. At the door, she paused. "For what it's worth," she said, "and I know it's not my business. I've done this kind of documentation for other women. I've seen what happens to those who stay, and I've seen what happens to those who leave." She looked right at Kate. "You made the right decision." Kate thanked her and heard her footsteps go down the stairs. She heard the front door open and then close. A moment later, another car pulled into the driveway, not one of the black SUVs, something smaller. She looked out the window and saw a woman she knew, Elena, who had worked for her father since Kate was 12. She had a face that showed no emotion, but a competence that showed everything. She was getting out of a dark sedan with a bag on each shoulder. Kate hadn't known Elena was coming, but it didn't surprise her. She changed her clothes, brushed her teeth, and stood before the mirror for a moment. She looked at herself, at the bruise, the dark circles under her eyes, at the 7-month pregnant belly that had made it through the night. She said to her reflection, quietly, "Okay." Then she heard the sound she had been waiting for, without even knowing it. The front door, footsteps on the gravel, a car door, an engine starting. Richard was leaving. She did not go to the window. She did not watch him leave. She had seen enough of him. She stood in the bathroom of the master bedroom. Her bedroom now, just and completely hers. And she listened to the sounds of his car driving away, the sound of the iron gate opening and then closing shut, and then the sound of nothing. The rain had finally stopped before dawn, and a special kind of quiet was settling over the house after a very long night. Elena knocked on the door at 9:15. "There's tea," she said in Russian, "and the lawyers are on the line when you're ready." "Give me 10 minutes, Kate said. She sat on the bed's edge, the same place she sat last night with that prepaid phone, making a call she promised herself she never would. She thought about that version of herself 12 hours ago, hands trembling, blood in her mouth, terrified of the chain reaction she was about to start. She felt a powerful tenderness for that woman, the same she'd feel for anyone brave enough to do the right thing when they were most afraid. She glanced at her real phone. There were 17 texts and 4 missed calls from people who didn't know her life had completely shattered overnight. She would handle them later. She put the phone down and looked out the window at the gray morning, at the old oak trees she had always loved and would now, somehow, get to keep for her daughter. They learned it was a girl 6 weeks ago. Richard had wanted a son, and Kate had just kept quiet, filing the information away. The baby moved inside her, a slow rolling turn that Kate now recognized as a kind of restlessness. It was the same movement she felt every morning, like a little voice saying, "I am here now." "I know," Kate said softly. "I know. We're awake." She pressed her palm against the movement, holding it there. Beneath the exhaustion, the pain, and the overwhelming complexity of what came next, she felt something. It was a feeling she had not had in this house in a very long time. It was something she had almost forgotten was even possible. She felt safe. In the hallway, Elena set down a tea tray while the attorneys waited on the line. Her father's men were quietly heading to their cars because the danger was gone. The Sterling mansion had, in one single night, become just a house. It was Kate's house, with Kate's name on a deed being processed right now in a Manhattan law office by three of the best lawyers Mikhail Vulov's money could buy. At 9:25, Kate opened the door. "All right," she said to Elena in English, feeling herself settle into a new strength. "All right, let's get started." The first lawyer call took 47 minutes. Kate sat in Richard's study, the room she was rarely allowed in, the room that smelled of his whiskey and ambition. She listened to three lawyers talk over each other about asset transfers and injunctions, and how Richard's team would claim he signed the papers under duress. She listened carefully. She asked only 4 questions, each one precise, cutting straight to the heart of what she needed to understand. When the call ended, the lead attorney, Calloway, her father's American lawyer for 11 years, paused. "Miss Volova," he said, "I must say, you've grasped all this faster than most clients I work with." "Oh, I've been preparing for this conversation for 3 months," she replied. A brief silence followed. "Of course," Calloway said. "We'll speak again at noon." She hung up and sat in Richard's big leather chair, the one he was always in, when she had the misfortune of needing to speak with him in this room. She noticed it fit her better than she expected. Not too large, not awkward at all. She placed her hands on the desk, looked around, and thought plainly, "This is mine now." At 10:15, Elena appeared with tea, wearing the expression of a woman who has managed so many complicated situations that she has almost become one herself. "Your father called while you were on the phone. He'll call back at 11. Also, there's someone at the gate." Kate looked up. "Who?" "A woman. She says her name is Diane Mercer." "A friend of yours?" Kate was quiet. Diane Mercer was her closest friend in Greenwich, the only person in this whole town she even partly trusted. Diane was the friend who brought soup without asking questions, and who, 8 months ago, had seen a bruise on Kate's wrist and said nothing, though her eyes had said everything. Kate had never told her the truth. She was protecting Diane, or maybe herself, or maybe the fragile illusion of her marriage. She was never really sure which. "Let her in," Kate said. Diane came in looking like she had driven way too fast and was trying not to show it. She was 41, with sharp eyes that came from a lifetime of paying attention. She stopped in the entrance hall, stared at Kate's face, and was completely silent for 3 full seconds. Then she said, "Tell me what you need." Kate felt a knot in her chest finally loosen. Not break, just loosen, the way it does when just the right pressure is applied. "Tea," she said. "And to sit somewhere that isn't his study." They went into the sitting room. Elena brought tea and then tactfully disappeared, understanding this was a private conversation. Diane sat across from Kate, looked at the bruise, and still didn't say what most people would say. No shocked gasps, no invasive questions. Diane was not most people. Kate simply said, "He's gone." "He left this morning," Kate explained. "The divorce is filed. The assets are transferring." Diane gripped her mug. "All of it, in one night?" She shook her head. "How?" "My father," Kate said. Diane stared. "Your father? The one who died when you were 12. Kate met her eyes. "He didn't." The silence that followed was the kind where your brain has to physically reboot to accept a new reality. Diane's mouth opened and closed. She set down her mug. "He's been alive this whole time?" "Yes. And last night he came here with several cars, several men, and a document that Richard signed." Kate kept her voice steady. "So now Richard's gone, I have lawyers calling me every 45 minutes, and my father's men are making sure everything goes through." Diane looked at her for a long time. Then, with her trademark bluntness, she asked, Who exactly is your father, Kate? Kate took a slow sip of her tea before she answered. He's the kind of man, she said carefully, who, when his daughter calls him at 10 at night because her husband hit her, arrives in Connecticut in 2 hours with 4 cars and a prepared legal settlement. She met Diane's gaze. The kind of man who has been watching my marriage from a distance because he knew Richard was exactly who he turned out to be. Diane processed this. And you're okay with that? With who he is? I'm 7 months pregnant with a bruise on my face, and my father got me out in 1 night, Kate said softly. I'll sort out the morality of it later. Diane reached out and took her hand, saying nothing more. It was, Kate thought, the perfect response. At 11 o'clock sharp, her father called. As usual, he got right to it. The Cayman transfer's clear by 4 p.m. New York is more difficult. Richard hid the assets behind 3 corporate layers. His attorneys designed it specifically to make this hard. Callaway is working on it. It will take 48 hours, not 24. Is that acceptable? Yes, Kate said. There is something else. A pause. It was short but heavy. Her father never paused unless he was weighing his next words. Sterling made a call this morning. It wasn't to his lawyers. Kate felt her chest tighten. Who did he call? A man named Gerald Fitch. Do you know that name? She had a vague memory. A business associate from before the marriage. Gerald Fitch is a Connecticut state senator, her father continued. Their relationship goes back 22 years. They have done things together that neither man wants investigated. Another pause. After speaking with Sterling, Fitch made 2 calls. One was to a private lawyer who handles emergency injunctions. The other was to a contact in the state police. Kate's grip on the phone tightened. Richard is trying to challenge the settlement. Richard is trying to build a narrative, her father corrected. He's going to argue he was coerced, that armed men threatened him in his home, and that the document is invalid. A beat. He is not entirely wrong about the armed men. Can he make that work? Not easily. The document is legal, the witnesses are solid, and your injuries are documented. But it creates noise. It creates delay. And in my experience, delay is the enemy of a clean resolution. A third pause, this one full of weight. I want you to be prepared, Kate. This might become public. Sterling has political connections. If he pulls Fitch into this, it could hit the news before we're done. Kate got up from her desk and walked over to the window. She stood there, looking at the bare oak trees on the edge of the property. Let it, she said. I'm sorry. Let it go public. She was surprised by how certain she sounded. She let that feeling sit for a moment, testing its weight, making sure it was real. It was. Richard spent 30 years building a reputation on the illusion of power and control. The real story? A man who hit his pregnant wife 3 times in 3 years and signed his assets away the night his father-in-law arrived. That is not a story that's going to help him. Not with investors, not with partners, not with anyone. She turned from the window. If he wants to make this public, let him. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then her father spoke, and she could hear the pride in his voice more clearly than ever before. All right. But Papa, I want it done cleanly. No blowback on us. Nothing that gives anyone ammunition about your involvement, beyond what's already on paper. Of course, he said. That has always been the plan. They talked for another 12 minutes, working through the specifics. When the call ended, Kate held the phone, thinking about what her father had said. About Richard calling Fitch, about the emergency attorney. She expected Richard to try something. She knew him that well. But she thought it would take longer. She'd figured on at least a day of shock before his survival instinct kicked in. He must have called Fitch, before he even left the house, maybe before sunrise. She felt a flicker of something, not quite admiration, but at least an acknowledgement. He was still fighting. In a single night, she had taken almost everything from him, and he was already on the phone with his senator. That, she supposed, is what 30 years of combat in the real estate world looks like when it has nowhere else to go. It wasn't going to work. But she noted it. Diane had stayed. Kate found her in the kitchen with Elena. The two of them were standing in that stiff, polite way people do when they agree to tolerate each other for someone else. The sight almost made Kate laugh, which was a surprise. She did not think she had any laughter left in her today. "I need to tell you something," Kate said to Diane. "And I need you to listen without reacting for at least 30 seconds. Diane turned from the counter. That's a deeply alarming way to start a sentence. Richard called a state senator this morning. He's trying to challenge the settlement. It may go public." Kate looked at her friend steadily. "I want you to know before it happens, because some of it will involve my father. And he's not the kind of person most people around here have ever met. I want you to hear it from me first, and decide for yourself what to do." Diane crossed her arms. "What kind of person is your father, Kate?" So Kate told her. Not everything. There were things she was still assembling herself, truths she was still adjusting to, but she told her enough. The structure of it, the family business, the years of distance, the wire of connection that had stayed taut between them anyway. The phone she had bought at a gas station in Stamford, the number she had memorized at 7 years old. Diane listened, very still, the way she got when something was serious. When Kate finished, Diane asked, "Does this change anything about who you are?" Kate thought honestly. "It changes the shape of things," she said, "not the center." At 1:45 that afternoon, Calloway called. The news stopped mid-sentence as she was talking to Elena about dinner. Richard's attorneys had filed for an emergency hearing. Not a full challenge to the settlement, not yet, but a temporary restraining order against the asset transfers, citing the coercion argument her father had anticipated. The hearing was set for the following morning, 9 o'clock, in Westchester County. Kate stood in the hallway with the phone pressed to her ear and listened to Calloway explain the implications in the measured tones of a lawyer managing a client. She felt the first real surge of fury she had had all day move through her like a current. Not because the move surprised her, but because of the audacity of it. Richard Sterling had stood in his kitchen and struck her to the floor, then gone upstairs and slept, then picked up a phone to call in every favor he had, just to make her prove in open court that she deserved to keep what was already legally and morally hers. "Calloway," she said, interrupting him, "what do we need to win tomorrow? We have strong documentation. The signed agreement, the physician's report, 2 witnesses. The coercion argument is weak. So what else do we need? A pause. Ideally, Miss Volova, we would benefit from any documentation of the prior incidents. The 2 previous assaults you described. Text messages, photographs, medical records if you sought treatment, anything that establishes a pattern of behavior that contextualizes what happened last night." Kate was quiet for a moment. Her mind raced, sifting through 3 years of exhausted self-preservation. "How quickly do you need it? Close of business today." She hung up and turned to Elena. "I need my laptop. And go to the master bedroom closet, top shelf. There is a dark green box behind the spare blankets. Bring it to me." Elena went without asking questions. Kate went to the sitting room, opened the laptop, and began to move through files she had been keeping for 2 years and 2 months. It was a folder she had labeled with the particular dark practicality of someone who has thought about leaving many times before, simply with the letter E for evidence. A folder she had never shown anyone. A folder she had added to, returned to, and sometimes stared at for long minutes before closing it, telling herself she was not ready. She was ready now. When Elena returned with the green box, Kate opened it. Inside were 3 photographs she had taken herself on her real phone, in the bathroom with the door locked. 2 of bruises and 1 of a cut above her eye that she had told Richard she got from walking into a cabinet door. A single handwritten note she had made to herself, after the second incident, dated and timed in the precise, compressed handwriting she used when she needed to make something external. Something she could point to, something that existed outside her own memory. A printed email from an address no one knew she had, sent to that same address. It was time-stamped, describing what had happened with a kind of cold, clinical detail that had taken her an hour to write, because she had to take breaks just to breathe. She looked at the contents of the box on the table in front of her. 2 years of quiet, careful, exhausted preparation. 2 years where some part of her knew, even when the rest of her was too tired or too frightened to act, that this box might be necessary someday. She photographed each item with her phone, forwarded everything to Calloway, and sent the digital folder from her laptop, all done by 2:40. Calloway called back at 3:15. "This is more than enough," he said, and the relief in his voice was clear. "Tomorrow's hearing will not go the way Mr. Sterling expects." She thanked him and set the phone down, sitting for a long moment with her hands folded in her lap. The box was still open on the table. She looked at it, at the photos, at the note she wrote, and felt something moving through her, alongside the exhaustion and anger, something unexpected. Something she had not anticipated feeling today of all days. Grief. Not for Richard, or not only for Richard, but for the years in that box. For the woman who had taken those photographs alone in a locked bathroom and then hidden them away because she was not ready. For all the mornings she had stood in front of a mirror and told herself it was not that bad, that she was managing, that she had chosen this and could unchoose it on her own terms, in her own time. For the version of herself that had believed for longer than she should have, that love was something you could survive by making yourself small enough to fit inside someone else's idea of it. She pressed one hand over her eyes. She gave herself exactly 90 seconds. She counted them. Then she closed the box, put it aside, and called her father. "The hearing is tomorrow morning," she said when he picked up. 9 o'clock, I know, he said. "Calloway already briefed me. I want to be there." A pause. "Katya, I want to be there," she said again. And her voice had the thing in it that she recognized from his voice. The structural certainty that lived beneath the surface. "I am not staying in this house while lawyers argue about my face and my marriage. I will be in that room." Her father was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then he said, "All right. And Papa, I don't want you there." "I'm sorry. I don't want you in the courtroom, and I don't want your men seen. I don't want the Vulov name attached to tomorrow. I want it to be clean. I want it to be about Kate." She paused. "Just Kate." Another silence. "This is a risk," he said. "I know it's a risk." She sat up straighter. "I've been living with risk for 3 years. I know what it feels like. I can manage it." A breath. "Let me handle this part." He took longer to answer this time. She could hear him on the other end, doing that thing he always did when he was truly uncertain. That small sigh through his nose. The brief quiet that meant he was actually thinking, not just reacting. She had forgotten she knew that sound until she heard it. "You'll have Calloway," he finally said, "and Reeves as your second chair. They are both excellent. I know, and you will call me the second this is over. Yes. And Katya," he stopped. Then started again. "You were never just Kate. I want you to know that I understand why you had to be, but that was never all of you." She held the phone, looking at the window as the last of the afternoon light filtered in. She thought of the girl who got on a plane at 19, telling her father she was going to live a normal life. And she thought of the woman sitting in this very room, with a green box on the table and a bruise on her face. And 3 of New York's best attorneys were about to fight for her tomorrow morning. She realized the distance between those 2 people was not as great as she had believed. They were the same person. They had always been the same. One of them had just been hiding for a while. "I know," she said quietly. "I know that now." She hung up and looked at the clock. 4:18. The money transfers from the Cayman accounts had gone through. Calloway had confirmed it before her last call. The Greenwich property transfer was underway. The New York corporate assets were the last piece, and they would be settled after tomorrow, one way or another. Diane was still there. She had moved into the kitchen and was doing what she always did in a crisis, which was cook. And the smell was filling the house with a warmth that Kate hadn't realized she desperately missed until she walked in. It had been so long since the house had smelled like anything other than tension. "Chicken soup," Diane said without turning. "Don't argue. You need to eat something that isn't tea." "I have a court hearing tomorrow morning," Kate said. Diane finally turned around and stared at her. "What?" "Richard filed an emergency hearing to try and block the transfers." She sat down at the kitchen island. "I'm going, Diane." "I'm going," she said again. "And I'm fine. And Calloway is the best in the state." She looked at her friend. "But I need you to do something for me. Anything. The woman I've been for the last 3 years. The one who made herself small, who covered bruises, who claimed she walked into a door. I need you to be a witness that she existed, that she was real, that what happened to her was real." Her voice didn't waver. "Because tomorrow, a man and his lawyer will try to rewrite what happened in this house. And I need to know that someone who saw it, even just the edges, is willing to say so." Diane was completely still. "I'll be there," she said. "You don't have to," Kate started. Diane's voice was firm and clear, full of the warmth of someone who has chosen a side without any hesitation. "I'll be there. In the waiting room. Wherever you need me, I'll be there." Kate looked at her for a moment. Then she gave a single nod, the way her father did when a matter was settled. She ate the soup. She ate all of it because Diane was right. She needed it. She was 7 months pregnant and going to court, and her body was the only thing she had for everything that had to happen next. She ate slowly and deliberately, with the focus she had brought to everything today. It was the attention of a woman who had stopped drifting through her own life and had finally started living it. Elena came into the kitchen at 7 o'clock and quietly said there was a development. Kate set down her spoon. "What kind?" "Gerald Fitch," Elena said. "The senator." He pulled out. She paused. "Apparently, a mutual acquaintance of your father's spoke with him this afternoon. He has told Richard's lawyers that he cannot help with the hearing and is no longer involved." Kate just looked at Elena. Then she said, "My father." "I wouldn't know," Elena replied with the perfect neutrality of a woman who knew everything. Richard had lost his political protection. Without Fitch, The emergency hearing was just a man with a weak argument against a documented history of abuse and a signed, witnessed agreement. Kate didn't feel victorious. She felt like you do when a storm you've been watching on the horizon finally turns away. It wasn't relief exactly. It was the release of a breath she didn't know she was holding. She went to bed at 9:30. The first time in 3 years, she'd chosen her own bedtime. She lay on her side, with one hand under her cheek and one on her belly. And she listened to the silence of the house. Her house. She thought about tomorrow, walking into that courtroom with her name, her bruise, and her green box of careful evidence. About finally standing in a room where the truth of what happened would be spoken out loud by people who could make it stick. She was not afraid. She searched herself honestly in the dark and confirmed it. She was not afraid. She was something else, something she recognized after a moment as ready. The baby moved, a slow and deliberate roll. "Tomorrow," Kate said softly, "we'll tell them everything." She was awake before the alarm. 5:47 in the morning, the room still dark, the house quiet. Kate was already sitting up, both hands on her belly, her mind already running through the day ahead. She had slept better than she had any right to expect. 6 hours straight, which was more than she'd gotten on any night in 3 years. She thought about what that meant and decided it was simple. The body knows when it's safe. It had been waiting a very long time for this. She dressed carefully, not in the calculated way she dressed for Richard's events, like a wife playing a part, but carefully in the sense of with purpose. She chose a dark blue dress because it was professional and because she'd always loved the color. She had stopped wearing it 2 years into their marriage because Richard once said it made her look harsh. She put it on, stood before the mirror, and thought to herself, "I look exactly like myself." The bruise was at its peak, just as Dr. Harmon had said it would be. The deep purple center faded out to red at the edges. She looked at it in the mirror without flinching. She thought about covering it, then immediately dismissed the idea. She was going to court to tell the truth, and the truth was on her face. She would not hide it for anyone. Elena drove her. Diane was already at the courthouse when they arrived. She was standing outside in the pale 9 o'clock light with a coffee in each hand. She had the look of someone who hadn't slept much and had no intention of mentioning it. She offered one of the coffees to Kate, who took it. They didn't hug. This wasn't a moment for softness. This was a moment for standing straight. Calloway was waiting inside with his second chair, a younger woman named Reeves, who had the focused, ready energy of someone who performs best under pressure. They found a quiet corner, and Calloway laid out the morning's plan in 12 minutes flat. Quick, precise, and efficient. Richard's attorney was a man named Harrove, a senior partner at a major firm in Midtown. Expensive, aggressive, and, according to Calloway, a bit rattled by Gerald Fitch's sudden departure from the scene. He expected to walk in here with political cover, Calloway said. He doesn't have it anymore. That changes his position significantly. What will he argue? Kate asked. Duress and coercion. He will describe last night as a home invasion by foreign criminals and argue the signature was obtained under threat. Calloway paused. He will also try to introduce character information about your father. Kate nodded. She had expected as much. And we will object at every turn, and the judge will uphold most of them, because a third party's character isn't relevant when there's documentation of the events. He looked at her. The proof you provided last night is the center of our entire case, Miss Volova. The photographs, the note, the emails. They establish that last night was not a single incident used to get a signature. They establish a pattern, a history, a context. He held her gaze. You may be asked to speak about that history. Are you prepared for that? Yes, she said without hesitation. They entered the courtroom at 8:59. Richard was already seated at the opposing table. He had dressed with care. A dark suit, a conservative tie, the silver cufflinks she'd given him on their second anniversary. From a distance, he looked composed. But up close, as Kate walked past him to her own table, she could see the strain it was costing him. His jaw was clenched tight. His hands on the table were perfectly still, the kind of still you have to force. As she passed, his eyes flickered to the bruise on her face. A shadow crossed his expression, there and gone in an instant. Then his lawyer leaned in, whispered something, and Richard quickly looked away. Kate sat, folded her hands, and stared straight ahead. She felt a strange, deep calm settle over her. It was not the fake calm she had practiced for 3 long years in that kitchen, the kind that keeps danger at arm's length. No, this was different. This was the calm of a woman who had absolutely nothing left to hide. The judge entered at 9:04. The Honorable Patricia Wynne, 61 years old, her reading glasses on a chain. Her expression was perfectly neutral, giving nothing away. She settled herself, opened a file, and reviewed it for 40 seconds. The silence stretched on, feeling much longer, until she finally spoke. Mr. Hargrove, you filed for a temporary restraining order on a settlement signed last night. Explain why. Hargrove was instantly on his feet. He was silver-haired, broad-shouldered, a lawyer who knew his very presence was part of the argument. He laid out his case with practiced ease, the cars pulling up, the strange men in the house, the air of menace. He argued the signature was forced, taken under conditions no one could call voluntary. He used the word coercion 11 times. He used the phrase foreign criminal elements twice, watching the judge's face for a reaction each time. Judge Wynne showed nothing. Mr. Calloway, she said, your response. Calloway rose. He was quieter than Hargrove, far more precise. He presented the settlement document, the witnesses at the signing, and the physician's report. He introduced the photographs Kate had taken in a locked bathroom over 2 years. He introduced a dated, written note. He introduced the emails, time-stamped, clinical, written by a woman who knew she might need them one day. He then argued, with perfect gravity, that the real question was not who was in the room when the document was signed. It was whether the woman who signed it did so of her own free will. And her 2 years of careful documentation answered that question completely. Then he said, Your Honor, my client is present and available to speak to the history she has documented if the court finds it useful. Judge Wynne looked at Kate over her reading glasses. Miss Volkova, she said. And Kate noticed, everyone in the room noticed, that the judge used her real name, not Sterling. Volkova. Either her lawyer had prepped the judge on the name change, or the judge had read the file thoroughly. Yes, Your Honor, Kate said, and stood up. She was sworn in. She sat in the witness chair, looked at the room, and felt the baby shift once, low and slow, as if settling in alongside her. She found the feeling centering, not distracting. Calloway walked her through it all methodically. The first incident, the date, the circumstances, the injury, and the reason she had not reported it. She answered every question in full sentences, specific and clear, neither downplaying nor dramatizing it, because her father had taught her the power of precision. And that, it turned out, was something you kept, even when trying to be someone else. The second incident, the third, last night, the green box, the years of documentation. Hargrove objected 7 times. Judge Wynne allowed 2. When Calloway sat down, Hargrove approached for cross-examination with the energy of a man following a script. He went straight for her father. "Miss Volkova, is it correct that the men who entered your husband's home last night were employed by your father, Mikhail Volkov?" "Yes," Kate said. "And is it correct that your father is the head of an organization that the United States Treasury has designated as a Objection," Calloway said. "Relevance." "Your Honor," Hargrove said, turning to the judge, "the character and nature of the third parties involved is—" "I will allow it," Judge Wynne said briefly. Hargrove turned back to Kate. He repeated the question. Kate looked at him steadily. "My father runs significant business interests across multiple countries," she said. "I am not here to characterize those interests. I am here to speak to the 3 times my husband struck me during our marriage." She paused. "If Mr. Hargrove would like to redirect to that topic, I am happy to continue." Someone in the room made a sound. Not a laugh, but something smaller. The involuntary release of a held breath. Hargrove pivoted. "Is it not true that you concealed your family identity from Mr. Sterling throughout your marriage?" "I did not volunteer information about my family, no. And is not that concealment itself a form of Mr. Hargrove?" Judge Wynne's voice was not loud. It did not need to be. "I am going to ask you to connect this to the restraining order, or move on." Hargrove moved on. He tried 3 more angles, and each one hit the same wall. Kate's composure, her precision, her absolute refusal to be led away from what had actually happened in that house. She did not perform emotion. She did not need to. The facts she had spent 2 years carefully assembling did the work that emotion would have only undermined. When he was finished, he sat down. Kate watched him lean over to Richard and say something low. Richard's response was a single word she could not hear. Judge Wynne removed her reading glasses. She took 45 seconds to review the documents in front of her. The courtroom was very quiet. "The motion for a temporary restraining order is denied." She said the documentation presented established a clear context for the agreement. It demonstrated a voluntary decision made in the interest of personal safety. "The asset transfers will proceed as outlined in the settlement." She looked over the room. "I would also note for the record that the medical documentation in this file will be referred to the Westchester County DA's office for review of potential criminal charges." That is all. She stood. Everyone stood. Kate sat for 1 moment longer before she rose. Just 1 moment. Her hands flat on the arms of the witness chair, her eyes on the front of the room, thinking about the woman in the bathroom with the camera, taking photographs of her own bruises and hiding them in a green box. She thought about what she would say to that woman if she could. She thought she would say it all counted. Every careful, exhausted thing you did in that room alone, it counted. You were building something, even when you thought you were just surviving. She stood up. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Richard caught up to her. His attorney was 2 steps behind him, saying something low and urgent, and Richard was not listening. He came to a stop 3 feet from her. They stood in the hallway with Calloway and Diane and Elena forming a loose circle around them. And Richard looked at Kate with an expression she had not seen from him before. Not anger. Not contempt. It was something stripped of both those things. "It's over," he said. He said it like a question that already knew its answer. "Yes," Kate said. "The baby." He looked at her belly. I want to be in her life. I know I do not have the right to ask that. I know what I have done, but I am asking." Kate looked at him for a long moment. She thought about her daughter, the weight and reality of her, 7 weeks away from being in the world. And she thought about what that daughter deserved in a father, and what she deserved in a mother who shows her what it looks like to face the truth. That will be for the courts to decide, she said, and for her to decide when she is old enough. I am not going to make that choice for either of you. She held his eyes. But I will tell you this. The man who existed in that kitchen last night, I will not allow that man near my daughter. Who you become after this, that is yours. That is entirely up to you. She paused. I genuinely hope it is someone different. She walked away. She did not look back. She walked through the courthouse doors with Diane at her left side and Elena at her right, and Calloway just behind. She walked out into the morning, and the clean air of a day that was nothing like the night that had created it. And she stopped on the steps and took a breath that reached all the way down. Diane put her hand through Kate's arm. Breakfast, she said. Somewhere expensive. My treat. Kate almost laughed. She did laugh. A small one. A real one. The kind that comes from somewhere you forgot existed. Yes, she said. Absolutely yes. Her father called at 10:20 while they were sitting at a corner table in a restaurant in White Plains that Diane had chosen because it was quiet and the booths were deep. Kate had ordered eggs and toast and was eating them with a real appetite, which she noted as a good development. Calloway briefed me, her father said. I figured. Judge Wynn is a good judge. She was fair, Kate agreed. A pause. The DA referral. I know, Kate said. I expected it. It is fine. It is correct. She took a sip of orange juice. I wanted it to go wherever it goes without interference from anyone. A beat. Understood, her father said. And she heard that he meant it. Papa, she set down the glass. I want to start the conversations we talked about. About the business, about the structure. I want to understand everything properly. A pause of her own. But I need 6 weeks first. The baby's due in 6 weeks, and I need that time. He agreed, of course, telling me to take the time I need, and then he wanted to sit down with me. Just you and me, he'd said, with whatever documents I needed to show him. No Calloway, no Elena, no one else in between. She heard the words come out and recognized her own father's tone, his precision in her voice. This was the inheritance she'd been running from for 10 years. I want to understand it directly from you, she'd said. The silence on the other end of the line lasted 4 long seconds. Then Mikhail Vulov said, I have been waiting for that conversation for a very long time. I know, Kate replied. I was not ready before. She glanced across the table at Diane, who was studying the menu with intense focus, pretending not to listen. She watched the morning light pour through the window. She thought about the 6 weeks ahead of her, the baby on the way, the house that was finally completely hers. She thought of the green box that had served its purpose and could now be put away for good, and the long journey of rebuilding her life on a real foundation. This time, it would be solid, not built on a performance and wishful thinking or a stubborn refusal to see the truth. She thought about the woman she was now, Katya Volova, who was once Kate Sterling, who had been a woman locked in a bathroom with a camera, who was once a 7-year-old girl memorizing a phone number, who would be a mother in 6 weeks, and who walked into a courtroom this morning with a bruised face, told the absolute truth, and won. Now I'm ready, she said to herself. She hung up the phone, picked up her fork, and ate her breakfast. 3 weeks after the hearing, the Westchester County District Attorney's Office opened an official investigation into Richard Sterling for domestic assault. The proof against him was overwhelming. 3 different incidents, 2 years of evidence, a doctor's report, and the testimony of a woman who was no longer afraid to speak. Richard's lawyers released a statement claiming he was cooperating completely. Kate didn't release a statement at all. She had already said everything that needed to be said. 5 weeks after the hearing, the last of the New York corporate holdings was transferred into Kate's name. The complex legal maze Richard built for a decade to protect his money had, in the end, protected hers instead. Calloway sent her a simple note. It just said, "Complete." She folded the paper, put it on her desk, and felt a weight settle in her chest, a sense of finality that was almost physical. 6 weeks after the hearing, on a Tuesday morning, as the light began to hint that winter might soon become spring, Kate's daughter was born. She was 7 pounds and 4 ounces, with dark hair and light-colored eyes that the nurses said would likely change. But in that first hour, they looked shockingly like her grandfather's. Kate just held her and looked at her, feeling the full power of something she didn't have a word for. It wasn't just joy, though that was part of it. It was bigger, containing the last year, the last 3 years, the last 10 years, all crushed into this one single moment. This child, this room, this very morning, this beginning. She called her father from the hospital bed, with the baby resting on her chest. "She's here," Kate said. There was a pause. When her father finally spoke, his voice sounded different than she'd ever heard it, all the power stripped away. Just a man. "Is she healthy?" "Perfect," Kate said. "She's perfect. And you?" Kate looked down at her daughter's face, at her dark hair and pale eyes, and that focused seriousness of a new person, seeing the world for the first time. She thought about the woman she was just 1 year ago, on a cold marble floor in a kitchen. Blood on her lip, hands protectively on this child who wasn't born yet, dialing a number she memorized at 7 years old, and changing her entire life. "I'm good, Papa," she said. "I'm really good." Her daughter then made a sound. It was a small, impatient noise, the sound of someone who already had opinions. Someone who would not be controlled or dismissed or made to feel smaller than she really was. Kate looked at her and knew, with a certainty she'd never felt before, that this child was going to be okay. She was going to grow up in a house that didn't have locked bathrooms or hidden boxes, or that low, constant hum of fear. She was going to know right from the start what her mother had to take 30 years to figure out. That safety isn't something you get from the people who should love you. It is something you build for yourself on your own terms, in a life that is 100% yours. Kate Sterling had walked into a marriage with a name that wasn't hers. She walked out of it as Katja Volkova, a woman who had been broken and hidden and knocked to the ground, but who got back up every single time. Who kept a box of evidence hidden in a closet for 2 years. Who memorized an emergency phone number at age 7 and finally used it at age 29. Who sat in a courtroom with a bruise on her face and told the truth until it was the only story left. She had done more than just survive. She had arrived, and in a room that smelled like disinfectant and new beginnings, with her daughter on her chest and her father's voice in her ear, her whole life was spread out before her. Like a door that was finally opened, Kate held on and did not let go.